Okay. Sorry, Michaela. I emailed Cadence, but I didn't get you. So we're sharing. Cool. And that's the correct screen. Yes, it is. Sometimes it splits it up, so I just want to be double sure. All right, it's all you, Melina. Yeah. Let me do this. Yep. Sorry. Okay.
So I got tetanus. Very common. It's not very common in the United States because everybody gets vaccinated, but
it's actually extremely common in other countries.
Yeah. But in the United States, not really.
Yeah.
Okay, do I have to click on it? Okay.
I think relatively speaking.
Yes. Okay, so yeah. Anyways, the CDC says, it's a bacterial infection by the genus Clostridium, and then the species. So the species is it's a neuromuscular disease. It's gram positive, and it's an endospore forming rod. So it looks actually kind of cool. Not gonna lie. So there, the little spore is, and then it looks kind of like a tennis racket. It is modal, and it's an obligate anaerobe. It's extremely sensitive to oxygen. Literally, that oxygen's gonna kill it. So what it does is just release a neurotoxin called tetaноspasm. And so what it then does, once it's in there, it binds to target sites on the peripheral motor neurons on the spinal cord, brain, and sympathetic nervous system. And the toxin blocks the inhibition of like muscle contractions, so it'll cause the muscles to like contract uncontrollably, and then that's technically called spastic paralysis. So that's what they're going to say. They're not going to, someone says, "Oh, he has spastic paralysis," they're not going to really say what it does. So here's a series of unfortunate events. Most commonly is if you like step on a nail, because really what I forgot to put on here. It is really common in soil, and also it's found in the gastrointestinal tract of animals as well. But it's really just in soil. So basically, you get the break in the skin. Now, the important part is if this, because you're gonna have blood flow, and blood carries oxygen. So if you're carrying oxygen and whatnot, and you step on it, may be okay. Also, if you're vaccinated, may be okay. But if you're this tissue around there is like kind of dead and whatnot, it can easily like spread. Just because again, it doesn't like oxygen, and if you're not carrying a good blood flow, it's gonna spread a lot easier. And so, anyways, so in the spinal cord, it kind of attaches to these junctions right here. And that's really important because that's your flexor and extensor, basically your muscle, like controlling that movement within your brain, I guess, or your nervous system. Basically, you tell it what to do. And so most times death can result from the paralysis because your muscles can't really contract and move like they're supposed to. And as you can see, this person over here, he kind of got that grin because he's his jaw's locked up basically. And so for the diagnosis, from what I found with the CDC and National Health Institute, there's not really any blood work or anything that they do to you. It's more of like a clinical syndrome, basically combining the signs and symptoms to understand it. So very commonly, for the presentations of the disease is the lockjaw, but they call it trismus. The spasms, muscle rigidity, difficulty swallowing or breathing, of course, caused by the muscle spasms. I think there's like one test that's like not very common that they'll call the spatula test, where they'll like take a spatula and like put it in your throat to see if it like contracts or not. Sounds really uncomfortable, I'm not gonna lie. But yeah. So there's the treatment and then the prevention. Treatment first really is just gonna use a combination of like the antitoxin with metronidazole, because I guess that's like a really well-rounded antibiotic used in commonly a lot of things in
It's, yeah, I mean, it's, we originally was introduced as like a anti-cortisol.
Yeah.
It works really well against the MCRO.
Yeah, so it's like a double bit of thing. And then of course using muscle relaxants to help like definitely relax your muscles so you're not all tight, because man. And then for prevention, of course, you can get the vaccine, and then you want to get your booster every 10 years to kind of make sure that your immune system it's still in your immune system to prevent and fight against it. So anyways, I have a really short, simple summary that if it'll play, will this play?
Try left clicking or right clicking on it, the other button on actual video.
No.
So,
That's
it
weird.
should on the video of mine, some of them do it, some of them don't. Let me see if I can get it. Because I used to have this issue, that's why I don't have as many videos in my presentations now, because I can't always get them to play.
It's literally like a 1 minute video. A lot of people like cartoons. Maybe easier to understand.
Screen last view next. I don't know why. That's just seeing it as a. Oh, was there? Yeah. Okay, hold on really quick. Let me see if it'll do this. Oh, I think maybe if I try this. Hold on.
Oh, enable content right there. There it is.
That's the
There we
security one.
go.
There it is. Yeah, it's a security thing. That's what it was. Okay.
There we go.
For us, I mean, there's
Oh,
that to
God.
worry about, but there's also,
Ignore
when
that
did
ad.
the truck arrive at the site? Are the kids?
Tetanus is a very serious, sometimes fatal disease. It's caused when spores of a bacteria called Clostridium tetani enter your bloodstream through a break in your skin. Once in, the spores start growing rapidly and making a toxin that turns your nervous system upside down. And although stepping on a rusty nail certainly can give you tetanus, it's not the only way this nasty bacteria can sneak its way into your body and cause havoc. In fact, it's easier to get than you may think. Tetanus is everywhere, in soil, dust, and even animal poop or manure. All it needs is a sliver of open skin, and it's in. That's why doing things like digging in the dirt without gloves and going barefoot outside aren't the best ideas. Insect and animal bites can also be an open invitation for tetanus. You can even get tetanus from things that don't make visible puncture wounds, like a tiny scratch, pinprick, or even a splinter in your finger or toe. And once tetanus is in, it's in. There's no stopping it. So what really happens when tetanus takes over? After it breaks through your skin and enters your bloodstream, it releases toxins that make your nervous system go crazy. Your abdomen becomes rigid, and you'll have painful muscle spasms all over your body. The spasms can be so powerful that they can even tear muscles and break bones. You may have heard tetanus called lockjaw because the toxins often cause your neck and jaw muscles to lock, making it hard to open your mouth, swallow, and even to breathe. Headaches, fever, sweating, changes in blood pressure and heart rate, and seizures are also common. Tetanus is not contagious. The only way you can get it is through an opening on your skin. However, there's no cure for tetanus. Once the spores invade your body, it can only be managed. As you can see, tetanus is a very bad disease that you definitely want to avoid. That's why prevention is so important. Fortunately, a highly effective vaccine offers full immunity from tetanus. The vaccine is given as a series of shots and boosters throughout childhood, but it's important to understand that you'll need to get booster shots every 10 years to stay protected.
There we go. Great job. Very, very short 2-minute video.
I liked it. Okay, so that's it for our student presentations for the day. So it's my turn. Let's go into our talk. Okay. So the nervous system, we know it consists of the central and the peripheral nervous systems. I don't want professional audio. Why is this here? Okay. That's essentially, we know this, where if you like go and stub your toe, or even if you get your finger severed or whatever, you can get it sewed back on and you regain nervous system function there. Still be able to move your finger, still be able to feel some things in the finger. There might be some permanent damage, but it can be regained. However, if you have damage in the central nervous system, it's done. And even now with modern medicine and the way that it operates, we still can't really restore function if your spinal cord is severed, for example. That damage is done forever. So that's actually a big feature of what can lead to the development of the symptoms of the diseases associated with the nervous system as well. There's different kinds of nerves in the nervous system dealing with sensory, so feeling and tasting and whatever that your senses, I guess we say there's 5 senses, but what those guys are going to do for you functionally wise. There's integrative, which is going to deal with motor function primarily, and then basically communicating between the thought processes versus like what's going to be coming from them. And then our actual no motor function, where we're literally moving the muscles. So there's a transmission of a signal to the muscles, integrative, and the motor function themselves. Kind of 2 different areas of the nervous system functions. With the brain and the spinal cord, we know the brain, the skull also protects the brain, and then the covering of the brain are meninges and the different 3 different layers of the meninges, which I won't necessarily ask you about here, but you would want to know for anatomy. Cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that essentially cushions and fills the spaces, so that if you get yourself in a car accident and you have a lot of shock involved in there, that CSF fluid is going to help protect that with that cushioning effect. It also is going to provide nutrition to the central nervous system. I'm not going to go over the structures of the peripheral nervous system. That's more of an anatomy problem. I'm not dealing with that. So we're not going to go over that. But one of the most important structural features that we do need to know, other than the basics of the brain and the spine and the fact that a peripheral system exists, is a simple fact of the existence of the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is a massive contributor to how a lot of these diseases are going to be presenting. It prevents things from crossing from the bloodstream into the brain. Certain drugs are able to cross the blood-brain barrier, and we've designed them to do that so that we can actually have effects on the brain. So when you get a headache, we can actually get drugs into your brain to help with pain in the area from any inflammation or minor inflammation or swelling introduced there. But some things can't cross. And actually quite a lot, most things won't be able to cross from the bloodstream into the brain the way that they would from the bloodstream into other tissues. And we also have immune privilege in the central nervous system as well. We have immune privilege in the whole nervous system, but it is extremely pronounced in the central nervous system. They have their own immune cells, essentially, for the central nervous system. Your white blood cells should not be crossing into your central nervous system. They are protected from going into the area by that blood-brain barrier, and the molecules on those cells make it so that they should be crossing over. So we have our own immune system, if you will, in the central nervous system. This is because we don't want overreaction of the inflammatory response causing damage to the central nerves and then leading to permanent damage that cannot be healed. So being paralyzed permanently, for example, from the inflammation associated with having had a disease. So you want to keep that down as much as possible. Otherwise, every single disease, infection that you had of your central nervous system would always lead, almost always, into paralysis. We're talking about having bacterial meningitis, and deafness would not be even the beginning of the problems that you would have. So the immune privilege, we're keeping that inflammatory response out of the central nervous system. We have our microglial cells that are phagocytic. We have our own brain macrophages that exist in our central nervous system. And so that is essentially those cells doing the function of the immune system only in the central nervous system, so that we don't have the inflammatory response getting out of control, and their activity as phagocytes is considerably reduced as well. We should not have, just end of story, end all be all, you shouldn't have any biome in your nervous system. Your nervous system should be sterile. There's no microbiota, which means every single stadium seat in your nervous system is open. It doesn't mean there's not stadium seats. Oh, there are. They're just not occupied. So that's why the blood-brain barrier is so important, because we have an open stadium sitting up there in your skull right now. And if organisms could get there, it's going to be really easy for them to populate those seats really quickly. So we need to keep them out, but we don't want the inflammatory response overreacting if they do get in. So it's a very fine dance to protect your nervous function involved there. Even if you had herpes, or if you had any other sort of disease, that any herpes virus, not just herpes simplex, okay? If you had any herpes virus infections, or if you had any other diseases that hide out in the nerves, that's not considered your biota, that's still considered pathogenic infection. So if you had chickenpox, for example. All right, we're moving on to the diseases, or at least the presentations that are within the nervous system. COVID. COVID is not a nervous system disease. We're going to talk about it in our presentations for the cardiovascular. Yeah, it's not a respiratory disease either. I hate to break it to you. It has respiratory symptoms, but it spreads throughout your entire bloodstream and can infect any cell in your body. COVID can. So it's not a respiratory disease. It's just we think of those symptoms first when we think of it. Can it be spread by air? Yeah, but so can a lot of other diseases that aren't really respiratory diseases, right? So that's not the indicating factor of what makes something a respiratory disease. Respiratory diseases are those that like present primarily in the respiratory system and don't go elsewhere. COVID does for sure. So that was a big problem with spread of COVID later on, which we'll talk about later. But if you've ever had COVID or ever known anybody that had COVID that had issues with smell or taste associated with it, and it can even present with long COVID where the symptoms are persisting, these neurological issues are part of the neurological side of COVID infection. So that's why we're mentioning it here. We talked about bacterial meningitis, but meningitis overall is such a huge topic. It's one that I can't really skip over, even if somebody presents over it. So meningitis is syndrome. It's not like if I tell you that, you know, this patient has meningitis. So if I say, okay, they have meningitis, what's causing the meningitis? Can you just tell me by the fact that I told you they have meningitis? No, right? There's not only bacterial, fungal, and viral, but there's all sorts of different bacteria, viruses, and fungi that can lead to meningitis. But they all have those same symptoms of the sore neck, the headache, and fever. Sometimes there is rash involved with it, and then the light sensitivity or photophobia. These are all very commonplace symptoms. Those symptoms define meningitis. That makes it a syndrome. If you think somebody has meningitis at all, if they come in there and they have a stiff neck and they're having signs like Budzinski's, I think is the word for it, Budzinski's sign, where like you lay, they're sometimes having issues with meningitis, you lay them down on a table and then you bend their knees up towards them while they're laying down flat. Bend their knees towards them if they have an instinct to lift their head, or if you do vice versa, if you lift their head and then move their knees up, that's a sign that they have meningitis because they're trying to alleviate the pain associated with the inflammation of the meninges. So that'll compensate by trying to give more space essentially for those nerves to move. They don't do it instinctively, it sort of happens as a reflex. So if they have that sign, then you're definitely going to be moving towards testing for meningitis immediately. Think a patient has meningitis, first things first, you're pumping them full of antibiotics. I don't care if you think it's viral or fungal, you're going to play it like it's bacterial because that's the most dangerous form you can have. Pump them with a broad spectrum of antibiotics, then you're going to be waiting on your lumbar puncture and gram stain of that lumbar puncture sample. Lumbar puncture to collect that CSF, that cerebrospinal fluid. Then you're going to be sending to the lab. They're going to immediately do a gram stain on it, and that gram stain is going to tell you which treatments to proceed with. Will there be other testing to narrow it down on what treatments might be even better? Yes, but this will at least help you take that first step towards, removing some of the antibiotics that you gave your patient right off the bat. But yeah, you're definitely starting treatment immediately without diagnosing the cause first. This is one of those that's way too serious of a disease and can kill you very quickly and lead to serious permanent damage very quickly. Treatment right away. All right. So a lot of these organisms that are going to be causing meningitis have their own virulence factors that can lead to the symptoms of meningitis that are pretty universal, but they can be different kinds of virulence factors for these organisms. There's chronic and acute forms. We're going to get into these categorizations based on whether they are bacterial or fungal or viral, essentially. Okay, so we're starting with bacterial. The absolute worst case scenario with bacterial meningitis is with Neisseria meningitidis. This is a gram-negative diplococcus, right? As are all Neisseria species. Now, Neisseria, when we talk about these guys, the pathogenic versions, Neisseria meningitidis and Neisseria gonorrhoeae are the absolute most common of our pathogens that you will need to know about if you're going into healthcare. If you have severe bacterial meningitis that has a rash associated with it, we're talking about an extremely deadly, probably about around 30 to 60, I believe, % mortality rate, if not more than that. And that can even include pretty serious mortality rate even with treatment. So this is a serious, serious version of meningitis, but the meningococcus is what this one is. So both Neisseria meningitidis and Neisseria gonorrhoeae, which we'll talk about in a sexually transmitted disease, obviously causes gonorrhea. Those guys are gram-negative diplococci. Look at the picture of the diplococcus here. Looks like a little butt, right? And that's very indicative of Neisseria species. They are very uniquely known for having that shape. They also have are motile, they have flagella, they also have a very distinctive capsule associated with them that's responsible for causing the disease associated with this. It's a horrible disease to have, it's very deadly, and it's not uncommon either. So you can actually carry this bacteria in your sinus cavities, normally as part of your normal biota. So it's pretty scary to think about, you might have it in here right now. There are vaccines available for our most common forms of bacterial meningitis, like the meningococcus and like the pneumococcus. But if you're not getting vaccinated, that's not going to help you. So you need to get vaccinated. Most universities, if you're going to be staying in a dorm, they absolutely require that you get vaccinated for the meningococcus. So obviously that makes sense because it can be very severe. This is Neisseria meningitidis developing into meningococcemia. Aren't you guys glad I don't make you say these words? Meningococcemia is whenever that bacteria is going to be spreading into the bloodstream and then into other tissues in the body. We already know it can cause the rash associated with Neisseria meningitidis, and that is a huge indicator that that is the cause of your meningitis as well. But the rash is actually petechiae, and petechiae are burst blood vessels. So we have inflammation of your smaller blood vessels. They burst open. We have, dead blood vessel tissue, and that's what's going to be leading to the actual petechiae. But if that spreads to other tissues in the body, it does the same thing. So here we have a little baby with necrosis and tissues resulting from the petechial lesions. And yeah, it's bad. So you can easily die from if it spreads to the essentially systemic version of this. It's really, really high mortality rate if that happens. And that's what you're trying to prevent. And that's why we pump you full of antibiotics if you show up with any meningitis symptoms. That's not the most common form of meningitis. The most common form of meningitis is Streptococcus pneumoniae. This is also the pneumococcus. So those are our two most common ones. We do have vaccines for both of them, the meningococcus, which we mentioned already, and the pneumococcus, which is this one. It's gram-positive. It's also a coccus, and it forms chains. Though they can be diplo in nature, they don't have that same unique look to them, and they're going to stay gram-positive. So that's why we do the gram stains as well. This one does not have petechial rash associated with it. So if your patient's showing up with meningitis and a rash, you probably already suspect that it's going to be the meningococcus and not the pneumococcus. But that's what that gram stain is going to confirm. What would I say? So yeah, this one's also got a distinctive appearance because you will see chains. They're not all going to be diplo like the meningococcus will be. So that's an important one. There's also other tests that we can do to help identify the differences. Another bacteria that can lead to meningitis is Haemophilus influenzae, another vaccinated version of meningitis. When you get older, and I mean older, like we're talking like, AARP older, this is more of an issue for our older folks, as well as sometimes little babies are going to be susceptible to this as well, but they really push this vaccine when you get into your retirement age. So this is the Hib. So if you ever heard of the Hib vaccine, this is that. Okay, so it's Haemophilus influenzae. It's a bacterium. I know it says influenzae. It's not a virus. Okay, that's just the name of the bacteria. Haemophilus influenzae serotype B is the most common version of this. It's a coccobacillus. It is gram-negative. So coccobacillus, it's not got that round shape. It's not going to do the diplococci butt thing. So we can already tell from the gram stain immediately the difference between the pneumococcus, the meningococcus, and Hib. right off the bat, just from a gram stain of the CSF, and then give targeted treatment for those. All right, another one for bacteria is Listeria monocytogenes. Listeria is a foodborne infection. Typically, we usually associate this with cold cuts of meats and things like that. So if you ever go to a deli when you're pregnant, you're supposed to be heating up the meat in the microwave. Almost nobody does this, but this is your risk here. I don't know. What did horse head? Boar's head of the brand. Yeah. So I will tell you this, most brands will have at some point outbreak with Listeria. They're going to test for these very commonly. And if even one of their samples comes back as positive, they're usually going to pull the whole lot and just assume that it is infected, because it's actually a really serious thing. If not just as serious as like when you hear about E. coli outbreaks. Listeria outbreaks can actually shut down whole like companies as well. It's not just going to be E. coli. It's just we think about E. coli more because we're more familiar with the name of it. But Listeria is gram positive. It's like a coccobacillus, usually presents more bacillus, and it is usually motile. It has at least one flagellum. It does not form endospores, but it's pretty hardy. It's not fastidious. It's resistant to cold. It can resist salt and pH extremes. It can resist bile as well, which is why we need to be cooking our food before we eat it. It grows inside of your cells. So it can actually migrate into the cells and live inside of them and then move from cell to cell within the cells, which is how it crosses the blood-brain barrier. It just moves into those cells of the blood-brain barrier, which is just a cell endothelial lining of your blood vessels, just thicker there. So it just moves through into the next tissue. So it's going to lead to listeriosis, which is a widespread version of the listeria infection. It doesn't just have to stay in the CNS. So you eat this food, it moves into various tissues of the body and can cause various effects. It can cross the placenta, just like it can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it has a mortality rate of 20% for infection if it does lead to infection of the fetus. So it can lead to abortion of the fetus. It can lead to the fetal death and stillbirth, miscarriage essentially, and then it can also lead to other permanent defects in the baby. So when I'm telling you we're talking about a death rate of 20%, don't mess around with it. Cook your freaking lunch meats, okay? Yes. Right. Bacteremia is when there's any bacteria in the blood. So we're going to talk about the bloodstream and the difference between bacteremia and septicemia in the circulatory stuff. But yeah, it is a difference. So bacteremia is any bacteria in the blood because it should be sterile too. And that makes sense. You think about your blood, obviously there shouldn't be bacteria in there. And then septicemia is when it's flourishing, like actually growing and infectiously growing. So yeah, so here's where we would have presentation of that growing in other tissues where it doesn't belong, such as the bloodstream. But so you can see this in dairy, poultry, meat. If you have a healthy immune system, this, like it says, mild or subclinical, but you don't want this to cross the placental barrier. It's not 20% death rate for like normal healthy adults. It's 20% death rate if it crosses the placental barrier is what I'm saying for the fetus. That isn't a risk most people want to take. It's a 1 in 5 chance. So you don't want that. All right, moving on to the fungal causes. We did all the bacterial ones. We talked about the major bacterial ones anyways. There's other ones, but anyways, we have Cryptococcus neoformans. This is found in bird droppings and is more common in folks who have AIDS. So immunocompromised people in general, but it's really most formally associated with AIDS. We can see here pictures of it where we have little buds breaking off, and that's how like yeasts and fungi can essentially multiply. So this is a fungus. It's more going to lead to a more chronic version of meningitis. Coccidioides or coccidiomycosal meningitis. It's like these words, man. But this is a mycosis. So this is a fungal infection, and coccidioides doesn't always, so it's coccidioides immitis, doesn't always lead to meningitis, but one of the things that it can cause is meningitis. The overall infection with it is called valley fever. Has very distinct morphology. When you look at it, it has these like little bottle shapes to the actual fungal cells themselves. I don't know what else to say about it, but it's a fungal meningitis that can develop. We see it mostly in the Arizona area, but it does occur in all the southwest, proper southwest. Yeah, it's fungal. All right, next are the viral meningitis. You might be like, oh man, viruses, but they're pretty hardcore, but they're not. You're usually going to get over viral meningitis on your own. It's only like not even 1% mortality rate with viral meningitis. So if you come into the ER and you're presenting with meningitis and they do your lumbar puncture and look at your CSF and they do the gram stain of it and they see bacteria that are clearly bacterial cells in there and they are staining as gram positive or gram negative, bacterial meningitis, we can narrow it down to our causes that we had. If they look at it and they see in the gram stain there are fungal cells, because you can tell that they're fungal cells even with the gram stain, there's cells there at least, that's a fungal meningitis. But if you look at a gram stain and you're pretty sure it's meningitis and there's nothing in it, it's probably viral meningitis. Because keep in mind, viruses are, you're not going to see them on a typical microscope that you're looking at a gram stain. So it's not like, also, I want to be clear, we talk about electron microscopes and how you can look at viruses. When you use an electron microscope, it's not like you get your sample and you put it on a slide and you just put it in an electron microscope and you can see it. There's so much prep work involved into it, and it's extremely expensive to run these microscopes as well and to maintain them. So those are not usually used in diagnosis. They're usually only used in like scientific investigations because of all the prep work that's involved in those samples. We just don't rely on them very much for diagnosis unless it's something extremely unique. But anyways, I wanted to say that you don't usually use electron microscopy for diagnosis like you do with gram stains and stuff. So if you've seen an electron microscope, you would know why. They're not like our microscopes. They're not just like a set with some mirrors and light. It's like we're literally shooting electrons at something. So there's like that whole device that's going to be enabling us to shoot. So it's like a hadron collider, if you will. Like we're shooting subatomic particles at something. Yeah. So it's not going to work the same way. It's just a freaking ridiculous concept when you really think about it. But somebody made it work and it is useful. But yeah. Hospitals might have electron microscopes, but again, it's like special case scenarios sort of stuff. All right, so viral meningitis, we're typically going to be just knowing that it's viral based on two things. Number one, you didn't have anything visible in your gram stain on your CSF. Number two, now we'll do PCR, because if it didn't show up in your gram stain, now you probably think it's viral. Then you can probably have an idea of what PCR tests to run to identify it, or immunofluorescence or whatever, ELISA or something, to help you identify the cause. So usually not microscopy for this one. Anyways, most of these are going to be caused by herpes viruses. More likely that meningitis is going to be associated with HSV2, which is the genital herpes, most commonly associated with genital herpes, okay? You can get genital herpes and oral herpes, like I've said, from both of them, vice versa. We mentioned that previously. So any herpes virus, though, not just the simplex ones, but like human herpes virus 3, aka varicella zoster, aka chickenpox, can also lead to the development of meningitis, as can things like measles. So there's a lot of viral causes, but 99% of cases are going to resolve on their own, just have support treatment. All right, summaries of meningitis. Neonatal and infant meningitis, we were talking briefly about this as well, most commonly is caused by Streptococcus agalactiae and Escherichia coli. These are common inhabitants of people's bodies, and they just get spread to the baby during birth. You also can find listeria in the neonates as well if if the baby survives it, if they weren't one of the 20% mortality rate. So that can be a concern as well. But yeah. So group B strep, they usually test this for you in your third trimester. Some doctors aren't good about it, but it's supposed to be common practice to test for group B during the third trimester later towards possibility of labor. If you test positive for group B strep, they'll give you penicillin, and so that you won't be as likely to transmit your bacteria to your baby. 10 to 30% of women carry group B strep in their vaginal canals. It's a normal part of your microbiome, but the baby isn't equipped to deal with it after birth, and so it can lead to the development of meningitis, and that's what the risk is with that, and why they usually are going to try to give testing and antibiotics for it ahead of time. Yeah, yes. So it'll be a stronger antibiotic typically, but that's what they'll reach for first is penicillin. Yes. Yeah, they won't want to just make you risk it, or they'll move for C-section if there's not a good option available. But yeah, E. coli. Again, 20% mortality rate with this one if it does cause meningitis in your premature babies, but it's obviously a common one in your normal biome. Moving on to meningoencephalitis now. We talked about meninges. If you hear itis at the end of anything, we've said it before, but itis means inflammation always. So itis, we heard meningitis. So itis is inflammation of the meninges. Meningoencephalitis is inflammation of the meninges and the brain. So encephaly is talking about brain. So meningoencephalitis is caused by amoebas. There's two different amoebas that can cause it, and we already introduced acanthamoeba with our contact lens talk. So we're starting with Naegleria fowleri first. Naegleria fowleri, again, this one's an amoeba that's flask-shaped, and it's going to be involved in warm freshwater, like lakes and swimming, poorly chlorinated swimming pools and things like this. You go swimming, you jump into the lake water, you get water up in your nose, and it gets through the blood-brain barrier into your brain. So that's what leads to meningoencephalitis caused by these amoebas. And you may be worth sitting here thinking we've already mentioned it, so you already gave away, the cell on it, I guess. But this is the brain-eating amoeba. Okay, this is one you're going to get from swimming in lakes and stuff. The other one, acanthamoeba, is the one that you'll get from like your contact lenses, from your tap water and things like that. That'll get into the eye typically. So this is usually from the sinus cavity. Don't be using your neti pots with tap water. You use a neti pot to rinse out your sinus cavities. Good for you. Any ENT will tell you that that is a great way to, keep your sinus passages clean and prevent allergies and reduce the effects of allergies or sinus infections and etc. It's a really good way to take care of your sinus cavities with isotonic water rinsed through your sinus cavities. And believe me, I know about it because I had that freaking sinus infection with a fungus for over a year, and I was using so many freaking neti pot rinses. It was ridiculous, and it helped a lot. But neti pot, so it's literally like a pot that, like, it looks like a teapot. So most of you guys probably know what I'm talking about here. That you put warm water in. It should be same body temperature, and it should be hypotonic. So you have some salt and like bicarb in it, and then you just like tip your head and pour the water in one nostril, and it comes out the other nostril. And that's how it's supposed to work. If you guys are using your neti pot and it's not going in one nostril and coming out the other nostril, you are not using it correctly. I'm just telling you. I believe me when I tell you this. Never use tap water for it. Okay. If you use tap water, always boil it for at least 30 minutes before you do, because of this. Okay. So because of not Naegleria fowleri, but acanthamoeba. Okay. Because Naegleria fowleri is more like a lake and stuff, but you can have Naegleria fowleri associated with tap water and the hot water tank as well. But that's more likely going to be acanthamoeba. But here we had between 2011 and 2021, that's a decade period, where we had 29 people that were infected from swimming. One of the people was infected by slip and slide water, and another one was neti pot of non-sterile water that was used for that. So you can buy bottled distilled water, heat it up in your microwave to body temperature and use that. That's what I used to do for my neti pots when I used to do them regularly. So if you're doing a neti pot, use distilled water that's already been cleaned. Okay. Save you the trouble. Acanthamoeba, again, is another cause of it. So we have Naegleria fowleri and acanthamoeba as our amoeba, brain-eating amoebas. So this guy causes a form of meningoencephalitis called GAM. This is granulomatous amoebic meningoencephalitis. Be able to recognize it. I won't make you write it out or say it, okay? But GAM is a slower forming version of the brain-eating amoeba disease, whereas PAM, which is Naegleria fowleri's card, it's primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. So those different. PAM is Naegleria fowleri, GAM is acanthamoeba. A granuloma, for those of you guys who don't know, is whenever your white blood cells wall off an infection, basically. So we have presentation of that with acanthamoeba infections. Both of these guys have a 2 to 3% survival rate, and they both progress quickly enough. There isn't usually enough time for us to offer proper treatment for them. But the other one, Naegleria fowleri, is faster and more severe. They're both bad. Don't get them. Acute encephalitis. We're moving on to just encephalitis now. We did meningitis, meningoencephalitis, and now just encephalitis. Pretty much most of the rest of this chapter is encephalitis. Right, so acute encephalitis. This is whenever we have major changes in neurological function. Often behavior changes can accompany this, mental, like mood issues as well. We have decreased consciousness, seizures. Sometimes meningitis will develop alongside of it. We treat these typically with acyclovir. We introduced this as an antiviral used for herpes primarily, but it can be used for a lot of viral infections. Acyclovir, another version of it is valcyclovir, which is AKA Valtrex, which is what's found in like Abreva and stuff. So originally made for herpes, but it works for a lot of viral infections. These are often caused by arboviruses. So acute encephalitis is usually caused by arboviruses. They're transmitted by bug bites. So that's what an arbovirus is. Viruses transmitted by bug bites. And most of these guys are transmitted by mosquitoes. So viruses transmitted by mosquitoes leading to encephalitis. All right. Best way to control these is by mosquito abatement and, insect repellents and things like that. Absolutely, number one, the most well-known one is going to be West Nile virus. You guys have heard of it. Most people who get infected are going to have no symptoms. About 70 to 80% of people who get infected have no symptoms. You've probably had it actually, and you just didn't know it. How could you, right? If you've been bit by a mosquito here in Oklahoma, you've probably been exposed to it. It's pretty common here in Oklahoma City area. So keep that in mind. You see how we have all these cases in 2020 with the green dots here? If I'm telling you that 70 to 80% of people don't have symptoms, do you think they're keeping track of the ones that don't have symptoms? How could they, right? So a lot of it's not up on the map, and it won't ever be because we don't know, right? It's like COVID. A third of people that get COVID don't have symptoms. How many more people were walking around out there that had COVID that didn't know? Or right now, right here, sitting in this classroom. So it really puts it in perspective, the danger of our asymptomatic carriers. Anyways, we know West Nile virus. A lot of these guys you probably haven't heard of. So we're going to just roll through them, okay? And it has the mosquito. It keeps it in the bird population. That's our reservoir. And it will sometimes step out into people. So a lot of these also zoonotic diseases. West Nile is, for sure. So we have St. Louis, La Crosse, Powassan, Jamestown. Eastern equine encephalitis has a 70% fatality rate in people who have presentation of the disease. It's very high. That's like Ebola level fatality rate. So that's insane. But yeah, you've probably never heard of it. All right, so that's our arbovirus encephalitis. So now we're going to move on to other forms of encephalitis now. So herpes simplex, we've said can cause meningitis. That was our HSV2 most commonly. HSV1 is usually associated with encephalitis, but they can, of course, they're pretty similar. They can interchange there. So we will reactivate our dormant HSV, and instead of having a cold sore, now you've got encephalitis. So congratulations. But this is pretty uncommon. We don't see it a whole lot. It's usually young children and older adults, again, when your immune system isn't as strong and it can't keep the virus in check. All right, so we're going to move on to subacute encephalitis now. These are the ones with less serious effects, but that usually are slower progressing as well. This is toxoplasma, persistent measles infection, which we'll only just touch on, and then the prion diseases, which we talked about just a minute ago with chronic wasting disease. Okay, Toxoplasma gondii or gondii. I literally don't care how you say it. I always just say gondii, and maybe I'm wrong with that. But again, you guys are trying to say your words. I'm saying them up here so confidently that you guys think I know how to say them correctly. I fooled you all. So Toxoplasma gondii, toxoplasmosis, and you may have heard of this one. So it's a protozoa that is going to be found in cats. So it's maintained in the cat population, the feline population. That's the reservoir for it. So it's a zoonotic disease. And let me tell you the story about toxoplasmosis. When mice or rats get toxoplasmosis and they're infected, it makes them have risk-taking behaviors significantly and noticeably increased. So they're more likely to go for that piece of cheese when the cat is sitting right there. That makes it so that toxoplasma gets transmitted to its normal reservoir, the cat. It's very common, extremely common in cats for them to be carriers of this disease, and they don't really have any true symptoms associated with it. But mice have thrill-seeking or risk-seeking behaviors, and so can people who have toxoplasmosis. If you've touched a cat, you've probably had it. So think about this now, because this is a conspiracy theory thing. Okay, it's not that I believe this, but I think it's interesting to think about how many leaders of the world are ruling at to the whim of toxoplasmosis. You know what I mean? So leaders of the world more likely to be risk taking potentially because of maybe it's toxoplasma that's your world leaders. Maybe it's toxoplasma that's your manager that you don't like or whatever. So it's interesting to think about that maybe that the week that you just realized, man, I really blew through money. I wouldn't buy a car. We were talking about getting a car, but man, I really just needed that car that week. Maybe you were infected with toxoplasma. It's crazy to think about it, but it has the same effect on us as it does on the mice. Anyways, this is way more serious infection for a fetus. If you are pregnant and you get this, okay, adults, whatever, you might buy a car, you might go shopping and go to Sephora and buy the whole place. I don't know. But if you are, baby that's growing in the womb, it can lead to stillbirth, miscarriage, and permanent defects. So it's a flagellated parasite. We have symptoms that are usually associated with just being ill, if you even have any symptoms. So most of the time, you're actually not going to be showing, you're going to be asymptomatic for most healthy adults. 33% chance that as a pregnant woman and you become infected with toxoplasma, 33% chance that it's going to be spread to the fetus. That can lead to stillbirth, liver and spleen enlargement of the fetus, liver failure of the fetus, hydrocephalus or increased fluid on the brain, convulsions, damage to the retina, and blindness of the fetus. 1 out of 3 chance that you're going to spread that to your baby if you become infected with toxoplasma. So you don't handle the litter box. If you are a single pregnant mother who has a cat and that litter box needs change, you go ask a neighbor or a family member to do it or hire somebody to do it, or put on gloves and a respirator. You do not need to be touching that litter. Don't. Okay. 1 in 3 chance. All right, next is basically what happens when measles turns into encephalitis. It's a slow progression into encephalitis, but essentially measles, you get measles, and years later you can develop this from having had measles. We don't know how or why. That's it. All right, prion diseases, we already talked about this. You have your normal protein. That's all squiggly and nice. And I'm actually going to draw it on here so that our online people can see it and so that annotates. So you have your normal protein that might look like this, and then the misfolded protein that might look like that. And obviously, if this has a normal function in this shape like this one's not going to function normally. In fact, if the whole reason this stuff in the middle in here in the center is in the center, that could be because it's all hydrophobic. It's all trying to hide away from the water of your body. So it's in there for a reason. But now on your misfolded one, it's out in the open. So it doesn't like that, right? So that protein, those parts, the hydrophobic or water fearing parts of the protein don't want to be out in the environment. So they're going to stick to other misfolded proteins with the hydrophobic and clump together and make these clumps. Those clumps, as they aggregate, form holes in the brain tissue, leading to spongiform encephalopathies, which is essentially just holes in the brain tissue, leading to the effects in the nervous system as a result. This is very slowly progressing disease. It takes decades for symptoms to develop. This includes things like mad cow disease or bovine spongiform encephalopathies. So what BSE is what that is. Mad cow disease, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. We have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease associated with just randomly getting CJD, or you have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease associated with eating mad cow disease contaminated meat. That would be variant or VCJD. Then we, and I say you can randomly develop this. That's literal. So you can have genetic aspects to this original functional protein, just weird mutations. It functions just fine. It's not like a bad problem or anything, but it's more likely to fold into the misfolded form. So you can be more susceptible to it. It doesn't mean you're gonna have it. Sort of like with breast cancer. You might carry the gene for it, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna get it. It's up to you to decide if that's more of a risk. But so that's the case with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Some people are just more susceptible to forming it, but you're not guaranteed to have it. I don't know much about Gerstmann, Streusler, Schenker. That sounds very German to me. But I don't know much about that one. We talked about chronic wasting disease in this class. It's a form of prion disease. It's not on this list, but it's a very probably the one that affects the United States more than any of these other ones do by far. It's in deer mostly. But then we have Kuru. Kuru is a human version of prion disease, very similar to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. But let's say you get your random Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, right? You just have a propensity for it. And so your body does it as you get older and just decides to misfold this protein, and then it spreads and forms a prion disease, a spongiform encephalopathy. It's transmissible, which is why we call them TSEs. It's transmissible. I know. Okay. It's transmissible, meaning that like if you eat the brain or nervous tissue of somebody that had these diseases, it can get spread. So Kuru is that, okay? It's cannibal spread of a spongiform encephalopathy. This is not like cannibals necessarily going out and killing people and eating them because that's what they do for food or because they hate you. This is whenever they have a loved one or a venerated tribe member die in their tribe, and to venerate them and respect their life, they incorporate their tissue inside of their body to become one with that member. So it's a very ritualistic experience. The men, however, get choice meats, if you will, the muscle tissue, whereas the women and children tend to be given the offal, OFFAL, which if you don't know, that's like organ meat and stuff like that. So they end up eating nervous tissue like the brain. And so they're more likely to develop Kuru. That's in Papua New Guinea, if you're interested. Fatal familial insomnia is, again, you have a genetic predisposition for this and it runs in your family. And then they develop this inability to go to sleep and then recover your body's strength and repair and everything during sleep. And they end up dying from not being able to sleep, literally. So that's terrifying. Okay. This is going to stay here, so just deal with it. Okay. We kind of already talked about this. I'm not going to keep going on about it. Zika, we know about Zika transmitted by mosquitoes. It leads to nervous system symptoms like Guillain-Barré, which is a nervous disorder. Pregnant women, it can lead to microencephaly, which is small brains. So you have a shrunken head associated with that. And it can be very serious for the fetus. It can lead to vision problems and other neurologically related issues. Most people who get infected with Zika are going to be asymptomatic. We know rabies, you have two forms of it, furious and dumb. Furious is where we have that aggression associated with it. Dumb just means that we have paralysis and coma pretty earlier on in the disease. You don't have as much of the aggression. You have stupor involved with it. You see cats being brought to vets that are stumbling around and they literally like look like they're drunk and they can't even stand up and whatever. They have rabies almost 100%. So they can't stand up and walk because of the neurological side effects of the rabies. You go to try to help them pick them up and they bite you and they just will always try to bite you and there's just no stopping the biting. That's the aggression side of it. That cat will be put down. There's absolutely nothing we can do for it. In fact, if we even suspect your animal might have rabies, we're putting it down. That's the end of it. So if you guys work at vet clinics and you get stray animals that are a little bit aggressive, you're putting it down. You're not waiting. You're not going to help that animal. You're putting it down. Because the risk of the spread of rabies to any of your veterinary workers, most of which who aren't going to be vaccinated at that, that's too high. It's too high for your workers, and it's too high to put that animal back out into society or into a shelter situation and risk somebody getting rabies. Once you have rabies symptoms, it's 100% fatality rate. So there's nothing we can do for that. It moves from the tissue into the nervous system, and once it does that, it's there. So there's nothing we can do. So it's really serious disease, causes an encephalitis. It moves into the salivary glands, you foam at the mouth, and then whenever you bite somebody, it transmits it into the next person. Reservoirs are going to be mammals. Any mammal in the world can have rabies. It's very, we'll say, wide host range, if we will. So we try to maintain keeping that down in the population by dispersing vaccines and vaccinated like treats that will like spread out in the wild. It actually works really well. So, but yeah, you see how this, I want to show you guys something on this. Inhalation of droplets. Spread to domestic animals and humans through bites, scratches, and inhalation. working in a vet and you suspect an animal has rabies, wear a mask around it. Wear gloves. I don't mean like latex gloves. I'm talking like huge leather gloves, okay? You don't want to get scratched. You don't want to get bitten, especially if you are not vaccinated, because the next thing you do the second that you think that you've been scratched or bitten by a rabid animal is send you immediately to the hospital. You're going to get your vaccine, but you aren't getting it in your arm. You're getting it in your belly. And that's where a lot of your lymph tissue is, most of your lymph tissue there. So you get shots in your belly and IV infusions of immunoglobulins to help with that passive infusion and protection. So here's where we can find rabies today here in the United States, our main reservoirs. If you're not paying attention, the white doesn't mean it's not there. It means bats. Everywhere in the United States except for Hawaii has rabies. Pack up and move, y'all. All right. Right, so that's rabies. Polio, we have acute enteroviruses. Enterovirus is a virus that gets in through the gut. That's all that means. So entero is always going to be gut. And we have encephalitis as well as other neurological symptoms associated with this. Can cause paralysis. It also has fever, headache, nausea, and myalgia. So we have, ineffective motor function associated with this, degradation of muscle tissue, and all sorts of nervous involvement. We have basically two forms of polio, paralytic and bulbar. So paralytic speaks for itself, actual full paralysis of the muscles anywhere in the body. And it doesn't have to be all of them, but any groups of them as well. Bulbar is talking about involvement of the brainstem and the medulla and cranial nerves. So we will have loss of the regulation of circular and respiratory function. Post-polio symptom is where you have continued degradation of muscle tissue after you've cleared the infection. So 20 to 50% of people might have that. This is the picornavirus that causes polio. It's one of the smallest viruses that we are aware of. It is transmitted by the oral route, so oral fecal or oral to oral. A lot of people were getting this from drinking water. Just drinking water out of the tap, you get polio. So now it's fecal. It's fecal matter that got it spread there. So we weren't treating our water for this tiny little virus. It just was making it through. So we ended up developing a special treatment plan to get rid of these tiny viruses. And it is what we reinstituted whenever we had COVID reintroduced. Like COVID was introduced into our water supply. Like I said, it gets everywhere. So we had to reinstitute our filtering process that we had in place for polio in order to clear out COVID. Thank goodness we had something already available to us to use. But yeah, you drink it, it gets into the gut, then it moves into the nervous system. It was a huge issue up until the 50s and 60s when we started vaccinating for it. It's a very effective vaccine. We still have issues of polio in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where they are having issues with cleaning fecal matter out of their water, and it's hard to get vaccine efforts in these areas. It's often war-torn or hard to get to the rural areas. One thing I do want to mention is the iron lung. If you guys have ever seen images of iron lungs, it looks like a one-man hyperbaric chamber, but like your head and sometimes your arms will be outside of it. People are paralyzed and their diaphragms are paralyzed as well. They cannot breathe. And without the help of these iron lungs, they literally would just suffocate. So the iron lung, what it does is creates pressure. It's like a bellows. It used to be an actual physical bellows at the bottom of the machine that just go up and down, and it creates pressure differences in the body inside of the chamber of the iron lung, and that forces the body to breathe. So it literally forces the chest to inhale and exhale. Yeah. Yep, he died this year. The last guy in an iron lung died in March of this year. He was in the iron lung for 72 years. In an iron lung. He was a lawyer. He published many books and is more successful than probably anybody in this room. And he was in an iron lung, no excuses. So that's some motivation if ever there was some. But yeah, he died at the age of 78. He's put in that iron lung at 6 years old. So crazy. So anyways, moving on. Tetanus and botulism are our last ones. Tetanus is we already talked about it, but just to reprise, spastic paralysis. That's important because what's happening is you are unable to relax. So your muscles will tense up and you can't relax. So you're paralyzed and your diaphragm can't breathe for you because it's seized up. So you usually, if you die from tetanus, it's going to be because of asphyxiation. So that's the number one reason for death from tetanus. Your diaphragm can't relax so you get the breathing going. There's really no effective treatment for tetanus once we have the obvious symptoms setting in, we can give you the antibiotics and antitoxins and everything like that that will help if you are going to survive. But there's no like 100% chance that you're going to be cured kind of a treatment. It's kind of like, we'll give you the best things that we can give you while your body's recovering. We hope that it's good. But yeah, once that toxin's in you, we have to just hope that it clears out. That toxin's called tetanospasmin. It's more common in other countries because of unclean birth practices in third world countries. And we have this all over the place in the soil, and the babies can get it and develop tetanus. This is the sign of what we see, that back is seized up and the arms are all tensed up like that. That baby is not going to relax. Then botulism. Botulism is caused by Clostridium as well. So again, when we look at Clostridium being anaerobic, gram-positive, endospore-forming bacteria, with this one, the toxin is botulinum toxin. It blocks the release of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine triggers for muscle contraction. So if we can't contract your muscles, you become paralyzed from flaccid paralysis. So both of these are Clostridium, both of these gram-positive, endospore-forming, anaerobes, but tetanospasmin is the spastic paralysis and botulinum toxin is the flaccid. So you can't contract. So then you die from asphyxiation because your diaphragm can't work because it can't contract. But same thing, really, we're just talking about whether you can't relax or can't contract. Pretty interesting, those differences in those toxins. Forget about Africans, sickness every time. This isn't a huge one, but it is Trypanosoma brucei. It's a protozoa that is transmitted by the bite of the tsetse fly. It's found in Africa. It leads to extremely severe fatigue, and people will just like fall asleep all the time. And a lot of times they die from accidents from falling asleep, like driving vehicles and things like that. But if they don't die from that, it's usually because of heart problems, secondary infections, or coma eventually if they don't get those other two. So it will eventually lead to death. It's a pretty serious disease, but it's uncommon. So we just don't see it a whole lot. But yeah, that's everything. Here is the nervous system summary. If you guys look at those, on what diseases are caused where. We have our questions for this one too, but I'll go over this in the review this weekend instead. We'll finish this lab early today, by the way.